In this video, we shall talk about high contrast images and how we can use shadows and highlights to enhance our photos and make them really interesting. I have a lot of example photos in this video for you. I will cover when and where you have the best chances of getting these types of photos and how you can do research in a very smart way to increase your chances of getting these photos using a very clever app that I'll share later in the video. So make sure you stick around just for that. And of course, I'll shed some light on the settings to get these types of images, what I find works best, but we'll take this from a beginner level so we can focus on photography rather than fiddle around with all the settings of our very advanced cameras. Right, let's start the video. Shadows and highlights, high contrast photography. Shooting high contrast images is one of my favorite styles to do street photography. The shadows and highlights can create some really dramatic effects in your photography under the right circumstances if you know what to look for. That's where this secret app I spoke about really comes in handy. A sunny day is typically when I would go out and look for those high contrast opportunities, but you can do this at nighttime and on overcast days as well. I'll talk a little bit about that later in the video, but we shall focus on sunny days because that is the best time to get these types of images. Personally, I like the early mornings and late afternoons when the sun is lower in the sky, when you get these long shadows to create the more dramatic effects. And the light is also a little bit softer in these times of the day. And when you start looking for these high contrasts between the harsh light and the deep shadows, spots you never thought would be interesting at all of a sudden has great opportunity. Let's take this image as a perfect example of a boring spot. It's very close to where I live and the next door neighbor happens to be one of my favorite coffee spots in Grünerløkka. The photo doesn't really have anything at all. It's just a building block, but on a sunny day one late afternoon, the light was really cool and I happened to be in the area with my camera. And this is what the light was like. Completely different. Just look at how much more interesting it is when you take advantage of the harsh light and the deep shadows. It goes to show that you should never ever write off a spot and call it boring, because it can drastically change into something completely different and much more interesting under the right circumstances. And this was taken in the summertime, so I took a mental note of that. Since light changes a lot throughout the year here in the northern hemisphere, each spot you might think be good for high contrast images can change a lot in the different times of year. And here's another one I took from the very same spot just a few weeks back in January. The gaps between the buildings really makes this light happen, and that's a good tip to get you started finding those potential spots for high contrast images where you are at. Find out where the sun is at different times of day and the different times of year, and that's where this app I talked about in the beginning comes in handy. It's called Photo Pills. In this app you can pinpoint your location on the map, set a date and find out how the sun travels across the sky. This will also give you the windows for golden hour and everything else you'd need as a photographer to find the conditions you want to get the results you had in mind. I'm a huge fan of smart apps like Photo Pills and I highly recommend you get that for research and planning. An example where I used this app was when I made this time lapse in the barcode area of Oslo. I knew the time window I had to start the time lapse and how long it would have to go on to have this effect of the shadows and light traveling across the building. And I've also been back to this spot many times after with street photography and high contrast images in mind when I knew I had a window of opportunity, and I got some nice results from there as well. Another example was just outside my apartment building where I got this image standing on my balcony. I used Photo Pills just for fun to see how the light was in my neighborhood and thought my street could actually have potential for some nice high contrast images, and this was taken in the summertime. And the last example image to really cement my point of how important it is to have good planning is this image right here. This was taken in January in the winter time and also just outside my apartment building. I think the shadows and the light, how the light shines on the hot dog stand there is brilliant. I loved it. And here's an exercise for you. Download Photo Pills and see how the sun moves in your neighborhood. You might be surprised and find some interesting opportunities for high contrast images just where you live. When I started planning using Photo Pills, I got much cooler images because I had a better understanding of where I could capture them. Like the ones from the barcode area in Oslo, and this one, just outside my door. So let's talk about where we can get high contrast images. And great spots to research would be areas with tall buildings and cool architecture with loads of windows, etc. I do love train stations and metro stops, the exits and entries into the metro stops. These are typical places where I've gotten my best and most interesting high contrast images in my street photography. To summarize this section, start researching the areas where you live and find out where you can find the contrast between highlights and shadows. Go to those areas and test them out. Look for gaps between buildings, find metro stops, entries and exits there. PhotoPills is a great app for planning and research. And more often than not, you will find other potential spots on the way to the spot you just researched that will also give you some nice high contrast opportunities. The final tip, if you don't have your camera with you but find a cool spot with nice shadows and highlights, use your phone to capture a test image and you can always come back with your big camera another time. I have a special folder where I store my test images on the rare occasion I didn't bring my camera with me. Phone cameras these days are excellent, so I'm not really bummed out if I forgot to bring my big camera. No one will ever question what camera you used with a well-composed image from a really cool location with an interesting perspective. And that was the daytime conditions. High contrast images by night is slightly different. I would typically look for bright advertising signs and posters to get silhouettes of people. Also, bright neon signs can create some cool looking images, and you can use color to really make your images stand out. Here is a couple of favorites that I took earlier in January. And that should give you some ideas on where to go and how to get those high contrast images. During the day, I find the early mornings and late afternoons better because you have the longer shadows, and I think that creates a bit more drama in your photos. Also, the light is a little bit softer. The app I use for research and planning is called PhotoPills. Great app, use that, try for yourself and see how that works in your potential areas for high contrast photography. And if you don't have your camera with you and you stumble upon a nice location with cool shadows and highlights, use your phone to capture test images, save them in a separate folder, and you can use them for later reference when you bring your big camera. I'm just going to assume that you know the basics of operating your camera, but if you'd like me to make another video about how I set up my Fujifilm for street photography, video and everything that I use my camera for, ask me in the comments. Also make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video if you aren't already. But let's start with the settings, and I like to keep it very simple if you are unfamiliar with your camera. So I set my camera to aperture mode and an f-stop between 7.1 and f16. So I get everything in focus, and I use mostly my 23mm on my Fuji. That's a 35mm equivalent on a full frame. I have the metering set to average, and metering means how your camera measures the light in the frame. So it adjusts the ISOs and shutter speeds accordingly. I want to adjust to compensate the exposure for the highlights and keep the shadows dark. That's my style of doing it, and the only thing I would adjust is the exposure compensation dial and set that to -1 or -2. That's what I default to on bright sunny days when I look for those high contrast opportunities. You could of course shoot everything in manual, but I'd rather be ready to make a shot quickly than to fiddle around with the buttons and settings. I do a bit more advanced on how my camera is set up, but it's because it's customized to me and how I shoot. And like I said, if you want me to make a video about how I set up my camera for street photography, video and everything I use my camera for, let me know in the comments. In short, set your camera to aperture priority between 7.1 and f16. Use average on photometry. That's how your camera measures light. That way you only have to think about adjusting one thing, and that is the exposure compensation dial that I have set to -1 or -2 by default on sunny days when I chase those high contrast opportunities. keeping it really simple. Then of course you have to go out and do your test shots of the spots that you have found for these high contrast images in the city or area where you live. So do just that, go out, take awesome photos, subscribe to my channel if you aren't already, like this video, it's completely free and it helps me massively. It helps me make more and better content for you. And I've got a lot more street photography related content coming. I'm working on a series that includes 2 POV videos from a certain city and an extended photo video guide from that city nowadays. Yeah, and it's basically an excuse for me to travel to other cities as well and go on my small camera adventures to explore with my camera, which is something I really love, and that's going to be very exciting. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one. Now my voice is completely falling apart because I've sat here for I think over 3 hours to try and record this because I've stumbled on nearly every word. If you, under the right circumstances, the shadows and highlights can create some really dramatic effects in your photos, or to do this cover or high contrast. A sunny day is typically when out on overcast days, and that's just how it is sometimes, but I made it, and I don't know how long this video is. I think it's probably between 10 and 15 minutes, something like that. I've spent 3 hours so I could get everything right, but I hope you got something from this video. I'm not going to ramble anymore because my voice is completely